what's up? I'm so sorry. It's another Spotify episode. I know we've been talking about this a lot, and it's consuming the entire monoculture, but I have to do another one because I got one of my favorite musicians of all time to come talk to us. Steve Albini will be our guest on the show later, of Big Black and another band that I'm not going to mention the name of, and Shellac, and what else? He produced In Utero, the last Nirvana album, and doesn't take royalties on it because he's cool and has music industry ethics. But anyway, that'll be coming up a little bit later. You should listen to the rest of the podcast. Why am I plugging the rest of the podcast? You're already listening. Hello, everyone. I'm Jake Flores. Anders Lee is here.
Washington Commanders Lee here.
Alex Patak is here.
We're coming at you live with music talk.
Yeah, that's a very odd bit to do given the nature of the musician that we're talking to. He wasn't... Well, I guess it's kind of... We're roasting him by doing, like, drive time radio at him. What's up? You are listening.
Right, it's his weak point. Like, it's a skill I've learned from video games. I find the little circle where I do the most damage to your health points. Yeah. And I fucking spam that shit. And that's how I take home the title at the end of the goddamn day with all my great podcasts I do.
It's the Morning Wacky Shack. We're here with Commanders Lee.
You're here live with Shellac and Rape Man.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that'd be awesome.
And then there's like a cow sound.
Ah, man. Okay. What's up, everyone? How are we all doing before we get into the episode today? Because
I'm doing well. I was clean living for a few weeks, and then I decided to go the other way with it and go on the bender. So I'm in the middle of that, and it's feeling pretty good.
I feel like every time I texted you for the last couple of weeks, you were like, "I'm drunk on a snowboard right now."
That's right.
That's pretty
Brooklyn?
Cool.
Yeah, that's right. I was drunk on a snowboard. That's how drunk I was.
Yeah.
Nice.
I was just on the street hoping. I was like, why am I not going down?
Well, it snowed.
In traffic.
You could skitch on the back of a cop car or something.
I mean, that's what apparently my mom has started. She got some old used skis and has just been cross-country skiing around St. Paul, which
That's
is
what's up.
a city but covered in snow. So you can do that.
North girls hit different.
Is she drinking too?
No, she's sober.
She doesn't. But she's not like that.
I'm doing well. I just won a Wikipedia flame war, an edit war, as it's called. They actually notify you.
Oh, I saw you posting about this.
Yeah, I finally basically won.
What page were you on again?
I was on CIA involvement in Contra cocaine trafficking, which...
Oh, you were doing psychic ops.
Yeah, I was trying to undo psychic ops, basically.
Well, you were doing your own op on their ops.
In a way. And for now, it's at a satisfactory level. It was getting changed back every like 5 minutes when I would do it. And they send you a notification eventually, and they're like, hey,
"You're being annoying."
Yeah, or there's like some mechanism where you can have a dispute resolved by someone else. It's like this whole bureaucracy. And in order to get taken seriously, you have to make an account. So I made a Wikipedia account. I am named Mr. Objectivity too. So I don't know how you're going to tussle with that. But the page had said previously that the CIA had been cleared of all narcotics activity, that there was no evidence of a conspiracy by the CIA or its employees to bring drugs to the United States, which is very precise, very particular, misleading wording. And that part I couldn't get taken down. However, I did get it amended a little bit because it said there were 3 investigations that concluded this, when really there were 2 investigations that concluded this, and one done by the CIA that found that assets were running drugs and that the CIA knew about it. And
can I ask what started this war you've been engaging in?
I've been doing research on the Contra cocaine connection for a while for a project I've been working on, and I naturally eventually checked out Wikipedia, and I found this to be horrendously misleading, and it was bothering me. And then finally, I struck up the nerve to edit it and learn how to actually fight for an edit on Wikipedia, and I finally got an addition to the end of the lead, which says that the other report, 1 out of 3, found that CIS had been trafficking narcotics, and the agency was not only aware of this trafficking, but dissuaded the DEA from investigating the supply networks involved. So the real debate was over what is an asset, because people say, oh yeah, there cocaine was going on and the CIA knew about it, but that's not the same as the CIA doing it. Well, if their assets were doing it, according to John Deutsch, CIA director, an asset is the CIA. They're one and the same. So
let me just read these Deutsch responses back to you, see what you say. It is cool that it was like you taking your time to correct this Wikipedia article, and then like a staffed Central Intelligence Agency operative just like, no, that's not right. Yeah, change it back.
I don't know if it, the truth might even be sadder that it's someone who doesn't have any relation to the CIA and is just a pedant.
Yeah, probably.
Who I'm arguing with.
There's like an anti-Antersley around somewhere.
Right.
Just a fan.
Waging a war of evil across Wikipedia.
But I couldn't even get the Deutsch definition up because it comes from a town hall that I watched. And just the fact that I observed this in the video is considered original reporting and can't be on Wikipedia. It's so technical and stupid. But moral of the story is eventually I won out.
The moral of the story is Anders won out.
Congratulations on your victory in a fight you had on Wikipedia.
Thank you for your service.
Very cool. Some of us like to fight on Twitter. Some of us like to really get into it with a CIA agent. Or maybe just some guy. Interesting.
Yeah. I was going to talk about Jackass, but we can save that maybe.
You can talk about Jackass. Did you see it? Was it good?
I did see it. If you know someone who is 60 years old and hurting themselves for laughs, call the police.
They're all old.
They shouldn't be allowed to do this.
They have like silver hair and shit.
They can't keep getting away with it.
No, it's just, Chris Pontius, just do Party Boy. You're gonna hurt yourself.
Didn't Knoxville break something?
He got hit by a bowl so hard he gave himself brain damage.
Cool.
Oh, okay. Well, he's already had that for a while, I would imagine.
Well, Kath was telling me about it. There's a phenomenon in the wrestling world where they refer to your bump card, which is how many hits to head you can take throughout your career. And the one that really gets you at the end isn't always the worst one. It's just that you've run out of punches on your bump card, and so you're all out of punches, and so you die or forget things.
Oh.
And that's where Johnny Knoxville, age 60, is at right now, as he gets rammed by one of God's hammers for your entertainment.
Oof. Is he wearing red?
I don't remember. It is probably the most fun I've had at the movies in some time. 5 out of 5 stars, people. Go walk. I mean, run, do not walk. It's the nearest Jackass motion picture film.
Matadors don't wear red. They wave a red flag at the bowl.
Right, but I'm thinking because it's Jackass, maybe they made it extra risky and just made him naked. And
oh, he is the red flag?
You should have written in with this idea.
Folks, ladies, if he's got a big weird hat that's kind of in the shape of a horseshoe and mariachi pants and he's hanging out in the middle of an arena, that's a red flag.
That's right.
Bunch of red flag emojis. Call me a bull because I'm running right towards them when I see a red flag. Dating is crazy. Welcome to Stand Up Comedy Podcast, Pod Damn America.
Ow!
Moo. Rape man.
We should clarify what that means.
You sure?
It's gonna come up. Let's just go to the interview.
I don't think we actually even said it. I think we said off mic. If you're not aware, Steve Albini was in a band called Rape Man at one point, and they named it after a Japanese comic book. And he's talked. I almost didn't even hit him with it because I think like every interview, people are like, "So the thing."
I'm on your Wikipedia here,
He's
and
famously, and we'll get into this part of it, but famously is like, not someone who's like sticking by that. Like he's a cool artist with authenticity and ethics who is able to go, that was a mistake, or he's called it like a bad tattoo before.
I remember. I honestly don't remember the name of the band, but there's some metal band with some flagrant name. I forget what it's called, but they, whenever they're pressed on it, they just post to a Doug Stanhope clip that says it's just about why you shouldn't get offended by words.
That sucks.
Justice.
That's fucking lame.
The clown is the one who can tell truth to the king.
God damn, dude. Just own it if you're gonna do something like that, man.
Yeah.
Just be like, yeah, I did that shit. Oops. End of story.
How hard is it to go like, oh, my bad.
Yeah. Or like,
I won't do that again.
Oh, the band's already named that, and I made all these t-shirts. So how about you give me 6 months or something before I change the name of my band? I don't know.
If the Washington football team can...
What if they were called the Washington? Oh, man. All right.
It's just be the next worst thing, which they did. Anyway, we'll have an entire episode about that, Nate, but...
We'll have many episodes about the name of the Washington football team for some reason. Okay, everyone. In the garage today, we got Steve Albini. Make some noise. Why am I talking like this?
Make some noise.
Make some noise.
Start clapping.
Get those hands clapping.
Give it up for your wait staff.
Let's keep this podcasting train moving.
Honk, honk. The podcasting train is here in the morning zoo. Big Black, the other band name. Okay, let's do it.
Lock them into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
All right. Now, somehow, we are speaking with a music legend, Steve Albini. Welcome to the show. Thank you for doing our weird little podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So while I have you, there's a couple of important things I wanted to get to, basically regarding what's going on right now with this Spotify thing. But in order to get to that, I think that for anyone listening who maybe isn't glued to their fucking Twitter or whatever, or maybe has muted the words Spotify, Neil Young, and Joe Rogan, let's recap real quick the events of the last week or so since Neil Young did this thing where he said, hey, I'm going to pull my music from Spotify if they don't pull Joe Rogan. Because, I even think I got lost a little bit because it got away from that and it became about royalties and stuff like that, which much cooler. But let's start here. So if you can help me out, what happened after Neil Young pulled his music?
So Neil Young pulled his music from Spotify in protest, essentially, and then that protest started to get a groundswell of other people who had control of their music, taking their music off of Spotify, in protest of Spotify underwriting Joe Rogan and his podcast. Then other apolitical and non-political and just sort of general musicians started to use that moment as a springboard to talk about the exploitative nature of Spotify and the music business in general, but specifically the way Spotify is part owned by the major labels, with whom Spotify has an arrangement granting them blanket license to their catalogs. So these artists that are signed to these labels have no control over the dissemination of their music. Like, they cannot take their music off of Spotify the way Neil Young can, because they are not in legal control of the recordings and the masters. Their record labels are, as a kind of a legacy arrangement from the pre-internet era when most of them signed their record deals. The record labels were given control of the masters for exploitation through any means known and unknown. And Spotify is a means that was at the time unknown, but because of that language, these artists have no way of, they have no leverage with respect to getting their music taken off of Spotify. And because of that very close arrangement between Spotify and the record labels, Spotify pays a nominal amount of money to the artists, but a large amount of money to the record labels to secure this license. The nominal amount of money is down in the, in like 2 or 3% of a penny. So, in the 10,000th of a dollar per stream, depending on a complex algorithm, the payment scheme of which is not public. So it's essentially impossible to be audited or vetted, except by these companies who are part owners of Spotify.
Right.
So if you're an artist, if you're in a band, and your band's music is on Spotify administered by one of these record labels, you get some measly amount of money from it or not, but there's no way for you to tell if you're being accounted to fairly, or even what the terms of the accounting are. There's no way for you to tell what the basis is on which you're being paid or not paid. And when I say paid or not, most of these record companies used contracts that allowed them to recoup from the royalties that would otherwise be paid to the artist, that allowed them to recoup whatever costs are incurred in the distribution of their music. So if there is a 3/100ths of a penny being accrued into a royalty account for an artist, it's quite likely that there is a negative ledger balance somewhere that the record company can use to attach even that piddling amount of money and say, well, yeah, you're not getting that. So it's a trust type of an arrangement where the record companies have agreed with Spotify that they will extract money from the audience for music and share it amongst themselves, while ensuring that the artists whose music is being listened to get essentially nothing.
Totally. Okay, so a couple things.
So there has been a sort of a groundswell of protest about that arrangement,
right? Which
was triggered by the attention brought to Spotify by Neil Young, because Neil Young objected to them underwriting Joe Rogan,
right,
who is a singularly destructive influence among the bros of America and the world,
Right. Yeah, so that paints a pretty vivid picture, I think, of what kind of happened. Because what's interesting is that now everyone's talking about the problem with the music industry, right? And not this Vax thing, because that kind of just served as the jumping off point and the moment of like crisis, that was able to be seized or whatever, which is totally fine. But before we even get into the whole minutiae of the music industry, what do you think about Joe Rogan and like the idea of disinformation and Neil Young's like sort of move here? I mean, he kind of laterally just moved to Amazon, which ultimately isn't really better than Spotify in a lot of ways.
I mean, in terms of its treatment of the artists, it's not necessarily better, because it also has blanket license arrangements with the record labels, yada yada. But they're not underwriting Joe Rogan,
right?
So the immediate complaint that Neil Young had is resolved, assuming that now bear in mind, Neil Young is probably not operating under one of these onerous contracts with a legacy record label. Neil Young is probably writing his own ticket with respect to who gets to distribute his music and how. So it's quite likely that Neil Young's terms are dramatically more generous. And the reason that I say that is that my band is on an independent label that was not part of the buy-in, the major label buy-in to Spotify. And so even my piddly band, which garners a tiny fraction of the plays that these other people get, is treated more generously than they are. So it's given that Neil Young has been a sort of marquee artist for a very long time, has been able to negotiate terms for himself that are favorable pretty much all along the way since the 70s, it's quite likely that he is doing better than the artists, the bands that are suffering under these streaming regimes, right? So on that basis, if he was doing okay monetarily under Spotify and he's doing okay monetarily under Amazon, the fact that Amazon is not underwriting Joe Rogan is a huge plus. So it's a win for him.
Totally.
But I agree that the mechanics of the music industry have always been structured in a way that allows the record labels who are offering contracts to ignorant musicians who have no defenses against this kind of manipulation, that those record companies are setting the terms, and that at the moment those terms are, extraordinarily exploitative and bad for artists that are on Spotify. And so I think it was the dude from Eve 6 posted that he would rather have you stealing his music.
Yeah.
Now, I have my gripe with the term stealing of music when it comes to just listening to something. I think that there is, I think that listening to something is a fair use in my mind. So I do mildly object to that term, but whatever. He says he would rather you get it for free than go through Spotify, which is nominally meant to be paying him. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. I think, music fans of my generation, I'm very old, I'm 59 years old. So music fans of my generation are used to the notion of one guy in the peer group buying a record and then dubbing cassettes for his friends, so that everybody could have the common experience with the record, but only one person has to buy it, right?
We had burning, our generation.
Yeah, and later generations was CD burning, and then LimeWire and Napster and file sharing and Pirate Bay or whatever, like all these places where you could get music from other fans without having to actually buy it yourself. And I, at the time and now, I think that was an enormously positive benefit and for the music scene. Not great for the business of selling records, like demonstrably bad for the business of selling records. But in terms of spreading the enthusiasm for music, creating a broader and wider and more worldwide audience for even the most niche music, it's been an enormously positive development. And I think especially people like me whose music is on the fringes of music, like I'm not in a popular band. The music I make is ugly and unpleasant. It it speaks to people who are not necessarily tuned into the social flow of the mainstream. Like for people like me, the fact that some weirdo in Montevideo, Uruguay can download a song of ours and find something to appreciate in it and become part of the scene that we are in, right, without having to go through extraordinary means to do it, that's a great benefit to me. That's an incredible thing that I applaud, right? From a music business standpoint, if I were running a record label, I can understand the perspective that guy just got a free listen and I'm angry about it. I can understand that perspective. I disagree with it fundamentally.
Sure.
And I think anyone who would be that cheap about listening to a song on the internet is kind of an asshole on all fronts. But I understand where that thinking comes from.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mention that because I was just reading about how in the 80s there's proto VHS technology, and the studios at first were very, very skeptical of it. And they said, well, if you're going to do this, if you're going to show a movie in your house, then not only do you have to pay twice the rate of a ticket, you also have to pay us for every head that's in your house watching this movie. And then somewhere along the line, they realized it's more profitable to just give everybody VCRs.
Yeah, I don't know if you don't know what your memory of this era was like, but originally when films were available on Betamax or VHS, they were sold at usurious prices. Like it was $100 to buy Jaws, or like $150 to buy Close Encounters or whatever, and that created the industry of the video rental store. Like that, the fact that they were charging so much per copy for buying these videos created an avenue for people to do the kind of sharing that we're discussing in music, but it created this, video rental store paradigm.
My first job.
Yeah. So the guy from Eve 6, who's a friend of the show and whose name is the full sentence, the guy from Eve 6, is, he said that back in the 90s too. This isn't like a recent thing where, he just got, keyed up on leftist podcasts or whatever.
It's around the same time that Lars Ulrich from Metallica was like shitting his pants about Napster.
Yeah.
All of the cooler heads around him were saying, motherfucker, you only have a career because metalheads were trading Metallica cassettes back and forth, Yeah. Like that. Like it seemed like such an insult to the very mentality, the sort of enthusiastic fan mentality that had given him a life in music. It just seemed like he was...
It's short-sighted because it's like these people clearly like you and they're going to come to the fucking show, but it's, there's like this huge capitalist framework hanging over this whole thing that's putting people in the situations of needing to be buying and selling. So I had a question about that because like I'm a big fan of yours, man, because I read Our Band Could Be Your Life and got into Big Black and I was like, this guy acts the way I think I act in comedy and stuff, and there's a lot of like personal ethics. Like people are always like talking about how you don't take royalties and stuff off of albums, which is insane because it's a thing no one should be doing if you're a recording engineer. But that's sort of like that's an embodiment of like personal ethics that we're talking about, using like our political beings to navigate individually within the system. My question is, do you subscribe to any like larger political agenda that would maybe fight exploitation on a mass level, or is this just kind of sure, go ahead.
My whole life I have been looking for some political community that I could 100% identify with. And it's been tough. I mean, there was a period there where there were some like just suit and tie Democrats, like normal, regular, straight ahead Democrats, like guys like Russ Feingold, who were like, and Bill Bradley, like guys that I resonate with those guys. They were as progressive in mind as, canonical leftists were. They were working within the Democratic structure to shift the Democratic Party in a more progressive way. Bernie Sanders, clearly, beloved by everyone he's ever served at all levels of government. Like there are individual people who I can identify with and think these people are working within a system that repulses me, but to an effective degree, and the way things like DSA and the way like the grassroots funding that Bernie and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the way that they have created an alternative to the sort of patronage model of campaign finance, I think is incredible. I mean, the fact that AOC doesn't spend any time fundraising because she has subscription funding and because there's a sort of a community outreach that is legitimate and real that is funding her campaign, like that means that she can attend every single committee hearing, that she can be there for every single vote, that she can be there to make the case for at every single debate. Like that is the kind of good governance that these sort of wholesale changes in the body politic have enabled, right? Yeah. I'm rooting for all of those to succeed. I want all of that to work. I find it hard to identify as a Democrat. Like, I'm going to vote for the Democrats if the option is Democrat or Republican, but I find it hard to identify as a Democrat when I see the Democrats, sandbagging Bernie, for example, or getting 100% behind an absurd military appropriations bill with no questions asked. Like things like that, they're galling to me as a progressive, and it makes me want to see those people out of office. But it also I also recognize that there is a paradigm that we're operating within, the two-party system, and I'm going to be presented with some like hold your nose choices most of the time.
Yeah. Well, somebody's mic is fucking up. I don't know who that is, but politics outside of the two-party system. Who the fuck? Okay. Somebody's cord was rattling. I don't know. But I guess like something that we're kind of into on, our show here being socialists is politics maybe outside of even the two-party system in terms of just like not necessarily talking third parties, but I mean like labor power and stuff like that. Like, do you see like unionization or anything like that possibly working within the music industry to alleviate some of these problems? Or is it, I mean, my brain kind of just goes, you need full revolution to really alleviate the fundamental problem within this, because art is not something that really should be a job, in my opinion. It should be a thing we get to do. Good.
I think we figured out whose microphone is shitting. Anders, your microphone is shitting.
No.
Engineer here.
Thank you, legendary.
Putting us on blast.
Recording engineer.
Okay. So there are a couple of things at play there. The idea of unionization for a large workforce, I think, is critical to a large workforce being treated like human beings, right? There is something more like a guild is appropriate for people like working musicians, where for the sort of standard gigs that people get, there should be sort of standard pay. Like if you're showing up as a session guitar player, just playing sheet music for Muzak or whatever, you should be getting the going rate for whatever that gig is, right? You shouldn't have to fight tooth and nail to get paid your worth for something like that, where there's a jingle session or whatever, like those should be sort of like reliable wages kind of jobs. The scenario where you have three guys in a garage writing songs as teenagers and they become a business entity of a band, and that business entity then has to interact with the larger music community, that's extremely problematic to unionize in the conventional sense, because within the band there is going to be a power structure with, and you can't really say to a three-piece band that they can't fire their drummer, like what if their drummer turns out, what if their drummer is a dick, Generally, it's not the drummer. I just want to point that out. Generally, if there's a problem in a band, it's not the drummer. The drummers are generally the cool ones.
So yeah, aren't they robots sometimes though, in your experience?
Here and there. My point being that that the labor model that works for people on an assembly line, or for people working at Amazon, or for people working at the post office, like the labor model that describes that kind of labor and those working conditions, does not work when you're working with small, self-contained, independently functioning entities like bands or a production company or a songwriter who then assembles ad hoc musicians to play with him. Like those are not comparable. And fundamentally, I think there is an awful lot resting on the concept of intellectual property. And that's a concept that I have been at war with for most of my creative life. The idea that you can parcel out the things in music that are important and pay individual people for those individual things forever because they own the idea of it seems insane to me, when so much of it is received wisdom or traditional music forms or tropes that are received and varied. Like it just seems like an inappropriate application of the notion of property, right?
Yeah.
But the music business has always tried to use that as its sole lever of compensation. Like we have the right to exploit these masters, so we're the only people who can make these records. So whenever we sell these records, we get all the money. And oh yeah, if we decide we want to end your career, we're just going to stop making your records and nobody else can make them then.
Right. Well, okay, good.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I think that the notion of intellectual property is suspect on its face. And I think the idea that should be the mechanism through which we, create equality or equity within the music scene is flawed, fundamentally flawed, because it's so open to manipulation and just it's so easy to create these fraudulent scenarios where you have like the guy that owns the record company is somehow the co-writer of every single song that this blues artist released over his life. You know, like those kinds of things. They're corruptions of a notion that on its face is kind of suspect.
That's why, to me, like the situation that Spotify is in seems like to be the logical conclusion to just the idea of having this idea of intellectual property and music being something that's commodified at all, which is why it's like a big picture thing that's really difficult to talk about, because how do you solve that? Well, I don't fucking want to say it on a podcast, you know, but wait, this fucking reminded me of another question about this. Oh, you've said, I've read a couple times because, you know, because like to catch anyone up on maybe like why this concept of an episode even came about. Steve Albini wrote famously in the 90s this thing called the problem with music, and then you had this Twitter thread today that kind of, or a few days ago or whatever, a week ago, that seemed kind of like an updated, you know, analysis of these interworkings of the way royalties and, you know, and the money that you get up front that you don't get again, recoupment and all that stuff works, that like lay people have no fucking idea about. We just assume that it works fairly or whatever.
So you are like one of the first people to actually write an article with the first three words in the title, "The Problem With," which is like every other article today.
Yeah.
You did it in the 90s. That's very impressive.
Yeah, he pioneered that. As music's own whistleblower.
Speaking to the point of intellectual property, that article, "The Problem with Music," was written for an art and culture magazine, sort of a fanzine quasi-magazine called The Baffler.
Yeah.
And in the frontispiece of The Baffler was the explicit statement that everything in The Baffler was in the public domain and could be reprinted and reused with no remuneration or credit by anyone in the world ever, forever. Right? That magazine, everything in that magazine was presented into the public domain, right? What that meant was that article that I wrote, "The Problem with Music," could be reprinted without my permission, without me needing to be asked for permission. It could be serialized. It could be used as the basis of another piece of work. It could be reprinted in whole, and it was reprinted whole in other publications without me having to be compensated or without me having to be consulted about it, right?
Yeah.
The entirety of that magazine's print run was in the public domain. And the argument against releasing things into the public domain like that is that, well, then anybody could print it, and then you wouldn't be able to sell any copies of it.
Yeah.
And I would point to the fact that issue of The Baffler has continued to sell very well in reprints for the lifetime of the publication, and it has been serialized into a book it has been collected and anthologized into a book that itself sold very well. I point to those as sort of practical examples of the nonsense of the notion that intellectual property is necessary to maintain the relevance and profitability of a piece of work.
Yeah, totally. The question I guess I'm kind of working towards, I'm really interested in this thing that I've read you say a couple times, which is that you think the streaming model will not sustain itself.
Yeah.
How's that work? What's going to happen, you think?
So this is going to be slightly technical and kind of slightly annoying, but
go for it.
At every stage of technological development, the music industry, as distinct from the musicians, has created a paradigm which the music industry thought would preserve its sort of gatekeeper position. So in the beginning, there were court musicians who worked for the court, and they were not allowed to write down their music and disseminate it because they were expected to be just playing it for their patrons. Like you're not supposed to play this music for anybody but us, so don't write it down anywhere. Don't let anybody else learn this music. So then music notation evolved, and music notation became how people would spread pieces of music beyond the group of people who originally came up with it. That music notation was then owned by publishers who would then say, oh, you want to hear this sonata? Well, you're going to have to buy the manuscript from it. You're going to have to buy the notation from us. Otherwise you can't hear it and you can't play it. So then when broadcast of music became possible through radio, the music industry, that is the orchestras and band leaders and stuff, were terrified that if people could hear music in their homes, this is true also of the early phonograph recordings. Like when phonograph recordings first came into existence, the idea was that if you could hear Caruso in your home, you wouldn't go to the opera house to hear Caruso. You wouldn't spend the money to go to hear Caruso. But what happened was that these phonograph records and cylinders could be disseminated widely. They could be shipped all over.
Yeah.
And so people in Ottumwa, Iowa, or, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, could hear fantastic music that they would never have an opportunity to hear otherwise. Right. And it created an audience for that kind of music, which created the possibility of local symphony orchestras and created the possibility of the touring musician, a musician who could go from place to place where he would be welcomed, or they would be welcomed, because there was an audience that had been created for them. Radio did the same thing. The band leaders were terrified that people wouldn't come down to the ballroom to see Xavier Cugat if they could hear Xavier Cugat on the radio or whatever. But what it did was it gave people a window into this excitement of a live music event, and it created an enormous audience for live music. And so then those people started going to live music events. So what happened is at every turn, there was a technological development or there was a cultural development that allowed for the broader dissemination of music, and the music industry reacted defensively to it. When cassettes became available, cassette recording became available, the music industry reacted in shock and horror and tried to halt the sales of cassettes so that people couldn't copy records at home. But then, as we described, copying cassettes for each other created a viable music scene for niche music that wasn't going to get played on the radio or whatever. And the same with CD recording technology. Like my studio still has a CD recorder, which we use to create listening copies for people from their sessions so that they can, take a copy of their session home with them to listen to, right? Still, to this day, there is an added tax on the blank CD media, which goes to the record companies as a bulk distributed payment, because that was the only way that they would accede to allowing CD recording to be legal in the United States, was by creating this cost overlay, so that when I buy a spindle of blank CDs to record my band's sessions, they're recording their own music. Some small fraction of that money goes back to the greater music industry to be distributed amongst all of the big record labels. And these are all mechanisms that were put in place to protect and maintain a sort of gatekeeper mentality or gatekeeper effect for the big controlling record labels, big controlling interests of music at the time, whether it was symphony orchestras or music halls, or in the current moment, it's record labels or vestigial record labels, what used to be record labels, who are now part owners of Spotify, right?
Yeah.
So the technology exists, or it exists in a crude fashion. Anything that's on Spotify, anything that you could listen to on Spotify, is certainly available somewhere else to be listened to for free. It's maybe posted on somebody's blog, maybe on a Bandcamp page, maybe on, some pirate channel, as they call them. But for sure, anything you can find on Spotify, you can find elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
So it stands to reason that some technology will be developed that will just find the free version for you and play it for you, rather than have to go through the effort of being a member, of buying a access through one of these pay per play kind of companies, right? And it may be a groundswell. It may be like an open source kind of political effect that creates this, or it may be somebody trying to monetize it some way by like, okay, you buy this app for a one-time fee and then you can listen to music for free for life or whatever. Like I think something like that is inevitable. And the moment that technology exists and is relatively low friction, then nobody needs Spotify. It might actually be better to have a thing that's not hindered by whatever Spotify's contractual obligations are.
Yeah, to me, like, we interviewed some people that are trying to start a streaming co-op where the money just sort of goes back, to the workers instead of some guy chopping it off all on top or whatever. And like, to some extent, the tech is all there. I kind of look at this and I'm just, probably the reason I'm wrong about this, but I'm like, why don't we just do that, right? Do they just have a monopoly on the hegemony of the name Spotify or something?
Well, there's also there's a huge body of popular music which is enormously popular with people who are let's call them low intensity music fans.
Yeah.
Like people who just want to have some tunes on at work.
Yeah.
And they want all the tunes that come on to be familiar to them, tunes they've been hearing their whole life, this whole legacy, this whole 1,000-year history of music. They want it to be stuff that they know rather than they don't want to be surprised by anything. So that's always going to be a market. The market for familiar and already popular music, that's going to be a huge market. And the better, things like Spotify obviously have tremendous penetration for something like that. Like if you're interested in dad rock and dad rock only, Spotify, I'm sure, is going to be your best option in terms of listening quality.
Yeah.
If what you're interested in is underground and small label stuff from the 60s, experimental jazz, noise music, things like that.
Obscure socialist podcasts, maybe.
Yeah. If you have
bad stand-up comedy,
then for sure there are going to be better options for you than Spotify. I've never had a Spotify membership. I was agnostic for a very long time about whether our music appeared on Spotify or not. I did not care. I assumed that it was like radio in that shit would get played on radio that I would never listen to, and I'm not using radio to find music, so it doesn't have any real interface with my personal life. And I can't imagine that my bands would get played enough that there would be any money generated from it, so I just don't even fucking worry about it, right?
Yeah.
It has transpired that Spotify does have enough of my band's music on it, and there is enough of an audience on it that it does contribute something to my annual income. It's modest, I think I could probably get a month's rent out of it over the course of a year, something like that, once it's all diced up among all the different band members and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's money. It is legit. There is legitimately money there. So now I'm kind of our band, the band I'm in at the moment, the active band I'm in at the moment, Shellac of North America, we haven't had a conversation yet about pulling our music off of Spotify.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure we will eventually, but we haven't had cause to talk to each other in the last couple of days when it's come to a head. But sooner or later, I'm sure we're going to have that conversation and we'll figure out what we want to do.
Well, you wrote about how that's kind of a different move for someone in your position because you do actually make a little bit of that money as opposed to it's unintuitive for us as listeners to go, wait a minute, why do you make more money than these huge famous bands? But it's because they're part of the fucking record label buy-in.
Exactly. It's because the more popular your band is, the more likely you are to be beholden to one of these big record companies who have you in an ironclad contract that you gives you no control over your music and remunerates you really, really, really poorly.
Well, let me ask you a question about that. Say a young fucking musician or comic or somebody is listening to this and they're thinking about making their first album and, the path has appeared before them and they're like, do I do indie shit or do I try to cash in by going to majors? What is the move at this point? Do you think you just...
I have no idea.
Really?
I mean, I do know that in the physical media era, in the era of records and CDs and cassettes, a record label would have access to things that would potentially get you a larger audience. They could get your music played on the radio with payola. They could get your music in the chain stores and the malls of America.
Right.
They could purchase promotion of your music that would get it played at the top of the hour on every top 40 radio station. There were material things that a record label could offer in terms of this search for stardom, right? There were things that they could do. We a great in at MTV. We can get your video in at MTV for sure, you know, or like we have an in with these hitmaker producers and they've done great work in the past and we can get them to agree to work on your record. Like there were things, material things that a record label could offer a band that was ambitious towards stardom, right? Now that's not really true. Like you're seeing more and more that the relationship between a musician and their audience is a direct one. Like if you make music, you can post it up on your Bandcamp page or put some videos up on YouTube or, you know, whatever other convenient social platform you have. And if you resonate with an audience, you automatically have an audience. You automatically have access to a worldwide audience with very little friction, you know?
Yeah.
So there isn't the argument anymore that you need a record label to get access to an audience, right? What a record label can offer somebody now is something like, you know, upfront money. Like you want to live well for the next couple of years while you're putting these records together, we can make it so you can live well for the next couple of years for sure. Now that might be the only thing you ever see out of your entire music career is this upfront money that we're giving you now, but we can give it to you now.
I mean, it's still a little tempting because you might not see that fucking money anyway, you know?
Exactly. Like if you're, I mean, I say this, this discussion comes up all the time and it's often framed as me, the smart indie underground guy, scolding all of these dummies for signing these major label record deals, right?
Yeah.
That's not it at all. If somebody had come to me when I was 17 years old and just started making music, I would have signed the first fucking thing that anybody wagged under my nose. Like for sure I would have.
Yeah.
You know, and then I would have been up shit creek for the next 20 years like all these other guys were. Right?
Yeah.
What happened was that I got involved in the punk scene. And within the punk scene, in that community, I saw people making their own records and selling them themselves. I saw that it was possible to do it on a personal level as an individual thing. I saw bands managing their own existence, making their own T-shirts, booking their own shows, like doing all of their own business.
Yeah.
I saw that it was possible, right?
Totally.
And so that's how I carried on. And from that point on, whenever anybody came to me, which granted, it didn't happen often, but whenever anybody came to me and said, hey, let us do some of the professional stuff for you for a cut, and you can just concentrate on the artistic side of it, right?
Yeah.
I was able to do the, you know, quick, you know, napkin math and figure out that that guy would be making way, way, way more money than he's worth. So I'm not interested.
Totally.
You know? And that's a kind of a truism in the music scene. Like whenever somebody offers to do something for you for a percentage, then by default, he's being overpaid.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm curious, as we're kind of talking about the chronology here, because you were active before and after this happened, and I know the impact was more on radio, but I'm curious what sort of impact the Telecommunications Act had on the music industry and what you do specifically, if you really noticed a shift there in 96.
So what happened was that the Telecommunication Act shielded some people from having to be responsible for the content of what they were disseminating, right? So that Google wouldn't have to pay for somebody getting access to something they weren't supposed to get access to. It also extended the copyright terms for copyrighted materials. So it used to be things that, like, things would fall out of copyright after a period of time. Initially, it was something like 17 years or something like that. I can't remember. And then it would fall into the public domain, or then it got to the point where it could be renewed one or two times and it would eventually fall into the public domain. And now it can be renewed essentially indefinitely. So, for example, things like Mickey Mouse are never going to come into the public domain. You are never not going to get shit for using Mickey Mouse on the cover of your record or on your T-shirt or whatever. Like, you are, even though it's completely baked into the culture and it is in the public domain in every way except the legal one, it has been prevented from falling into the public domain in the legal sense.
Yeah.
Right.
And
that was Clinton's big accomplishment, because there's like, the history is ending. Mickey Mouse is going to be free use unless we do something drastic. And Hollywood got on his case and they basically made him do this. Yeah.
So every point, these protective measures have been presented to the public as being a way for artists to get remuneration for their art. Like, we want to make sure that these creative people, these artists and writers, that they keep control of their stuff. And what it really did was it allowed the corporations to whom these rights had been assigned to continue monopolistic exploitation of all of this material.
That's a big thing. They always use small business owners as like an example of you have to protect this person, but it's ultimately in the interest of big business every single time, because small business guy doesn't make any fucking money off of art, you know?
And I'll give you an example. I'll give you a sort of a figurative or a sort of a generic example, but this is the sort of thing that happens all the time. Because copyrights have been extended so much, let's say that I stumble across a cache of material from an unsigned artist, or some music that was on a small record label, which is now defunct, but the rights to that material survive, and whoever bought the assets of that record label owns the rights to that material. They don't know it. And it may be impossible for me to convince them that they are in that position. It may be impossible for me to find out who that person is. But until I do, and until I get clearance from them, I cannot reissue that material, regardless of the perspective of the performer, the artist, the writer, the person whose music it is. That music must remain under lock and key unless and until formal license can be granted for it. Otherwise, you're subject to getting sued by some shareholder somewhere that discovers that, you know, you released a bootleg version of something. So there are entire swaths of our culture which are now lost. They're going to be orphaned and lost because the chain of custody of the rights to the material survives, right?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that there's no active interest in exploiting the material at the moment. If anybody tries to make use of it, you can't, right?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just saying that's one of the many knock-on effects of saying that intellectual property is an inviolable and now sort of endless obligation.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And it's funny now because, like, you know, when it comes to the U.S. government's view of like the global South, like hunger, poverty, you know, climate change effects from that. It's like they'll deal with it, but dear Lord, there are street vendors in Bangladesh that are selling The Adventures of Pluto Nash. We need to freaking invade this place or set up this, you know, legal regime. It's the sense of urgency with that versus other problems is just tells you all you need to know about the system.
Yeah. Well, speaking of double standards, I'm going to steer the ship here a little bit in a different direction because I want to get to something that I really want to hear your opinion on, because this is a comedy podcast and Joe Rogan is hilarious in all the wrong ways, and he said some fucking shit today that's pretty funny about being called out about using all these racial slurs on his podcast. And at the root of this, the seed of all this, there was this this ongoing stupid fucking argument that never ends online about free speech. And this let me start here. Okay, so today, like, Rogan made this video where he's like, yes, I really need to talk about this thing I said. I'm sorry, I took it down, yada, yada, yada. It's pretty funny, right? He's a dumbass. But, you know, I think he said that he was taken out of context, and that's usually what guys who get in trouble for saying a thing, you know, that pisses people off say, especially in comedy, is comedy can never fail, can only be failed. Like, everything is, my intention was always right, but, you know, if it didn't hit, it's just taken out of context. In the video he said, but even in context it was bad. Fucking crazy, right? But I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about how, like, the point of view of people that get put in the spotlight for stuff like that and judged for stuff like that is always that you need to be as apologetic as possible to me as a comedian because my intention was fine, and, you know, every possible interpretation of this is bad. Whereas,
I mean,
that doesn't go both ways with those guys, because then anyone criticizing them is also shouldn't be seen as a human whose intentions are good. They should be seen as a fucking attacker and someone who's the word censorship is getting thrown around to an extent that is nerve-wracking for me, a guy who was actually kind of almost censored by the government, where, you know, all these people are just acting within the private market. Neil Young isn't censoring anyone when he takes his music off of a thing he doesn't want to take it off of if he owns his music, you know. Free speech is like the fucking through line of this dumbass part of the argument. I mean, well, I guess right off we'll start here. How do you feel about all that?
Well, I mean, as someone who has said insensitive and rude things and callously used charged language, racist language, sexist language in creative projects, like I'm 100% guilty of that. And I think that cop out of saying, "Oh, you're not using the whole context. You're not understanding it. That was actually noble and good." I think that's a total dodge. Like I'm an adult who is willing to take responsibility for all the things that I've said over the years, all the things that I've done over the years. I think, you know, I just feel like it's a total cop out to, on one hand, present something as your art and say, I want you to take this seriously. This is my creative output, right? And then somewhere in there is stuff that on reflection is hideous and was insensitive and was a mistake on my part or on Joe Rogan's part. Then when somebody else notices that, and for sure he noticed it before, Rogan knew that he said all that shit before anybody brought his mind to it, you know, brought his attention to it. When someone else notices it, to get defensive and say, oh, hey, you got to look at the whole body of work here. That's just a little episode. That, you know, you're taking it out of context. And besides, I'm just a guy telling jokes. Don't take me seriously. Like, at the time he did it, he wanted everybody to take it seriously.
I feel like if he hadn't gotten in trouble, he would never have thought about it like this. He'd have been like, exactly, the joke was great, you know, if it killed.
As somebody who has said a bunch of stupid fucking shit that I now have to own up to, like, I feel like that's like the first step of any kind of maturation, is to say, over time, I have grown and learned, and some of the choices that I made when I was younger, with the wisdom that I have now, were clearly mistakes. Not just mistakes, but they were hurtful. That, you know, in my particular case, the culture that I was in, the underground music scene, the underground culture that I was a part of, the transgressive element of the art was a pretty important signifier for all of us about what we were doing. Was we were breaking societal norms, right? We thought society was hidebound and parochial and puritanical, and we were gonna willy-nilly just break some of those norms. Some of those norms of propriety developed because certain parts of society had been subject to horrendous abuse, like the feminist perspective developed because of the mistreatment of women and the minimization of women in culture. The civil rights movement developed because of the horrific treatment of minorities by the mainstream, right? So those things as norms or as modes of thought were not the same as like religious puritanism or racism on its face. Like, they were not the same. But in our community, they were those things were all seen as boundaries, and our rule of thumb was, well, it looks like society is taking care of all of these problems, so we can step over any of these boundaries with no real consequence.
Right.
And that was a mistaken notion on my part and on the part of a lot of my peers.
Yeah.
Now, some of the people who worked in that space at the time have gone beyond the fringe and are now just like full on fucking right wing, racist pieces of shit. Like some of the people in that community, like, turns out they were actually, they weren't speaking ironically, or they weren't speaking for effect. They weren't using shock value for its own sake. They were voicing an ugly part of their psyche that was legitimate. Right.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, I've had I'm not excusing that behavior, but I had as an explanation for that behavior that your mind wanders, you know, and the creative mind wanders more than most. And when your mind wanders into an area that's uncharitable or that's bigoted or that's ugly or that's abusive, if you inhabit that mind for the moment, you're not necessarily becoming that as a person, right?
Right.
That's the explanation from a creative standpoint that that gave me license to use that kind of language and those kind of images and that kind of thinking, right? I now realize and recognize and accept that using language like that is still using language like that, whatever its intent. And you are adding to the volume of that kind of abusive language, that kind of minimizing or subjugating language. You are adding to the volume of it.
Also,
whatever your intent.
The effect is the effect, whether the intent was what this, that, or the other, or whatever. I wanted to ask you about this because this is kind of central to like my whole fucking thing. Because like, in comedy, there's a term for people that really stick on this sort of stuff called an edgelord. Like, this guy's really into the edge or whatever. And like, I get a lot of shit from people online for having been perceived as someone who like left that world. But I am still an edgelord in the sense that I still understand in the right context, like to use the fucking dumb term here, I still make a fucked up joke from time to time in a way where I don't think it's going to leave the room and then hurt somebody if it's because it like I do understand as the creative type the thing that you can do where you ironically take on a thing like that, and it does cause, you know, a degree of stimulation that like, you know, there's an argument even you can make that like some people really like that kind of shit because it gives them dominion over that sort of thing or whatever. And like, I've never really left that. I mean, what I learned and what I think a lot of people that like don't learn and refuse to learn and end up just going down the right-wing rabbit hole is that like no one's even asking you to stop having these sort of creative impulses. They're just asking you to control them. And the market plays into all this stuff because we're being, you know, we're seeing ourselves as players in it and then going, well, anything that I do in this that doesn't sell is a fucking attack on me because I'm using it like to, you know, to feed my family or whatever the fuck you're lying.
Yeah,
but like,
I mean,
you know,
and that's just so patently untrue. Like the most popular, like the like every other Netflix special is called something like Triggered or I'm Offensive or whatever, you know, and
yeah,
I mean, all of that plays into this mentality that like, if you have these base instincts and you're suppressing them and you feel the active suppressing of them is some kind of a burden on you, that you're unburdening yourself briefly by being outwardly racist or sexist or whatever, like that somehow that's a liberating moment for you, right? And that other people who don't want you to experience that brief personal joy of being able to use the N-word or whatever, like those people are somehow keeping you down, right?
Yeah.
And when those people don't give a shit about you, what you are doing is sending up a flare trying to get their attention. You know?
Yeah.
I just find that the notion that there is any kind of oppression from the outside or any kind of, I mean, no one was paying attention to old Joe Rogan podcasts.
Yeah.
Right? Like if all the ones where he talks about like, yeah, maybe the Grand Canyon was carved by Martians, you know, like nobody cares about that. Right.
Yeah.
I'm a bow hunter. Every time I down a deer, I like to cut the liver out and eat it on the spot. You know, like whatever. Nobody cares about any of that, right?
Yeah.
Because the transgressive moments for him were so exhilarating in the moment that his joy in being able to rub people's noses in that is palpable. And that's what people are reacting to. They're not reacting to the pure language.
I think
they're not reacting to the existence of those sentences.
Right.
What they're reacting to is a guy who feels empowered and liberated by debasing other people.
And I think he's being disingenuous about that, because it's always presented as like, oh, well, you cannot judge this because it was within this, context of like a fake playtime that exists when you're doing comedy where none of this actually matters. But clearly, like, you're right. The Joe Rogan podcast isn't interesting. The reason people are frothing at the mouth and fucking fighting for it is because it's become a centerpiece for this culture war that's about like the argument about it. It's not even about the fucking content. And
now I should say that I had, before recent events, I had some friends who would defend Joe Rogan as being just an open-minded guy who would have anybody on his podcast and let them say whatever they were going to say unfiltered, and that by itself had value. I have close friends who are not dummies who would postulate that as the value of something like the Joe Rogan podcast, right? My response to that was to listen to a few Joe Rogan podcasts, which are just teeth-grindingly unbearable, right? To a person of my mettle, right? And then to scroll back a bit and look at some of the guests that he has invited on, and look at this, just the arc of the story of who he wants to give an audience to, and what those people want to say to an audience that Joe Rogan has massaged into existence for them. Yeah. Like, look at all of the people he's had on, what their perspectives are, what they're trying to say, what beer they're selling, right?
Yeah.
And then ask yourself, why is that considered open-minded? Well, it's not. It's got an orientation. Joe Rogan may not be bright enough to have a philosophy about any of this, right?
Right.
But what he clearly has is an orientation, and his orientation is toward these free-thinking IDW racist kind of.
There's no such thing as objectivity, because if you are a person who has biases and things that are going to sound nicer to you and people that are going to actually approach you, if you are a guy with that much power and money. So even if you think I'm platforming every person I meet, it's like the question is, well, who are you meeting, and which of these ideas are taking off and are, you're kind of helping a little bit because they benefit the point of view that you aren't even aware that you have, because you are just a dude who fucking smokes weed all day and shit, I mean, the conservative grift, I think, to me is it's all about passivity, because like you can't be blamed if you're like, I'm just doing what feels right, and there's a fake sort of idea of like objectivity there or whatever. But like, let's get back to him a little bit, because the byproduct thing we're talking about, there's a distinction to be made, and they always obfuscate this. They always obfuscate criticism of what they're saying with like an attack on whether they should be allowed to say it.
They already said it. It's not even a debate.
Right. And what's going on with like his jokes is, as if you criticize, the fucking bad jokes he makes, the defense is you're trying to stop me from being able to say these. No. The argument is just, I'm talking about whether it's good or not. I don't really care that bad jokes exist in the world, but I am a fucking comedian. I get to talk about it. It's like my fucking thing, With him, there's a byproduct of, this thing that's old as time, which is promoting hateful ideas accidentally even. But then there's also this new question of like this becoming a fucking health risk with the COVID thing. Is there any precedent for there like being anything beyond a discussion about that? Because like, I don't really think, I think Spotify's bad for the original reasons, the money stuff. We could kick Joe Rogan off of Spotify. He's still going to be the most famous podcaster ever, and people are still going to listen to this. But like, what can anyone do about the fact that this misinformation and hatred is coming off the side of this fucking thing as like a byproduct or something? Or can anything be done, or do we just fucking talk about it? Or just talking about it, fight it, which is like, I don't know about that. Nobody listens to this fucking podcast, but
yeah, I'm not into reactive behavior. Like I don't think it's helpful to wait for something to enter the public consciousness and then try to counter it, because then you're always on then you're in an environment where you're reacting to an agenda that they set. The people that are the people that have an agenda that is harmful and destructive, you're operating on their playbook. And I just think it's worth making the case that while there is a global fucking pandemic that's killing thousands of people every day, the first thing on our minds should not be how soon can we stop being careful. You know, maybe wait until it's not fucking deadly outdoors before you say, hey, let's go outside sometime. You know, that's if you're actively promoting a notion of community and a notion of caring, rather than reacting to people who are rejecting the notion of community and rejecting the idea of caring.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm not sure where I come down on this ultimately, but something that's been raised, it's that obviously we're not talking about government censorship, right? That's not really on the table here, but corporations essentially do have a monopoly, right, on mass media. So in a way, if they decide to take something off, that is on a material sense a form of censorship. And you know, on this question of objectivity, because you're right, there is no objectivity, but is there a risk there in if we say, you know, Joe Rogan is wrong on COVID and therefore shouldn't be denied this platform, that could lead to things that we're saying? You know, I've been in a Wikipedia.
I just want to point out that no one is saying Joe Rogan should not be on Spotify. Literally, no one is saying that. What people are saying is, I don't want to be on Spotify if Joe Rogan is on it.
Yeah. That's
what they're saying. What they're saying is, you do what you want with your fucking platform. I don't have to be a part of it, or I can extricate myself from it if I think it's an overall destructive influence. That is absolutely not censorship. That is absolutely not. It is people.
No, it's free speech.
In a capitalist sense, it's a fucking market decision. People are saying, I don't want to be associated with this. It's bad for my brand, or some bullshit like that. Like I reject the idea that individuals saying, I don't want to participate in this thing. I don't want to pay for Spotify. I don't want my music to be on Spotify. I'm not going to use Spotify for listening. I reject the notion that that is censorship. Right. So, that's that out of the way. No one is saying there should be controls in place to prevent speech like this from getting out. No one is saying that. No one is advocating for that. What people are saying is that we will decide what we will associate ourselves and our creative output and our life's work with. And I can't see any argument against that. Yeah. I shouldn't have to put up with being on a stage with somebody who is, you know, a destructive influence.
Right. I guess and again, I don't have the answer to this, but I'm thinking of, you know, Palestine, for instance. If there's an artist who's doing things that are supportive of Palestine, using their Instagram, let's say, to support Palestine, how do we prevent, you know, them being purged from social media, or our, you know, left-wing ideas from being purged from social media? I mean, maybe this is just a separate question.
Yeah, what you're saying is, how can we make these big corporate overlords think like us? And I don't think that there is a mechanism for that.
I think censorship generally only moves in a leftward direction anyway. Like there's a complete imaginary paper tiger.
I don't know about that. I mean, there are fucking schools all over America where they're banning books, and there are laws being enacted all over America that allow sort of conservative review of school materials so that we can make sure that children are being indoctrinated correctly into a notion of America that we approve of. Like, you know, there is right-wing censorship, like, you know, all over the map. There is like legitimate right-wing restraint on speech that is happening on a governmental level and on an institutional level that is not happening with respect to the left.
Well, I meant that censorship happens to the left, not by the left.
Yeah.
Because most things that are, you know, right wing, like even something I noticed like while I was thinking about this Rogan thing is that like the imaginary like 1984 thing that is happening to these fucking Facebook people's brains is that somehow there's an authoritarian like government that's coming in and stopping all this stuff, and the government isn't at all. All of this stuff is being censored by the market. But like with Rogan and the vaccines and stuff, they're imagining that the vaccines are sold on an individual basis, and that like by individually not taking them, you're somehow fighting the thing. Which actually, I was thinking about this the other day. I might be wrong about this. Tweet at me if there's some minutia I'm missing. You work in medicine or whatever, but isn't prolonging the fucking pandemic actually to the benefit of the people that sell the vaccines to the government to then be sold in these batches, because they go bad and then they throw them out and shit, and like it's actually making them tons of money that probably wouldn't be in their interest if there was like something like a patent free vaccine or something like that.
And this is our vaccine, like our tax dollars made these vaccines, right? You know, the Pfizer and Moderna's grifted money. They skimmed money off the top by distributing them, but this is technology that was made by our tax dollars.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just ironic because it's it's like a fucking Twilight Zone episode or whatever. The guy who thinks he's a patriot at the end of the day looks in the mirror and it's like, I'm giving all my money to the government, but I don't know. I mean, maybe we're getting too far away from the fucking whatever's relative to having our guest here or whatever, because none of us are medicine people, but I guess I wanted to round out. I wanted to maybe get some final thoughts before we we close out here, because I unlike some people, I don't like to make 4-hour long podcasts every fucking day of my life. I like to get short and sweet with it. So I mean, I guess my question is, where do we go from here? Music wise, in terms of the movement that seems to be happening, the crisis that we've been able to take advantage of,
Well, I think that the first step is people should be aware of how their money is being spent. Like when they spend money on a Spotify subscription, to whom is that money going and why? And that from an educational standpoint, I think that the stuff that the music union, I can't remember the name of the union, but there's a formal union that is sort of promoting the awareness of the relationship that Spotify has with the major labels. And the guy from Eve 6 or whatever, the public perception of that is starting to shift. There's starting to become an awareness of it, and the guy from Eve 6, his line, he had a tweet the other day where he says, "I don't think we're going to be able to make sweeping systemic changes in the music business, but I think we can give Spotify's CEO and their shareholders a really bad month." I think that's a perfectly reasonable, attainable goal. Like make them shit their pants a little bit at the notion that their listening audience is going to be aware of their business practices and is going to hold them to account, even to a degree, even if it only affects like this quarter, right?
Yeah,
it still had an effect, and if it boosts the use of other alternative platforms, either like sort of free sharing amongst peers, or things like Bandcamp, like I'm reluctant to posit that any one of the alternatives to Spotify is the good one, just because they're all companies and companies are going to operate in their own best interest one way or another. But Bandcamp, for example, for the duration of the pandemic, Bandcamp has been doing these things called Bandcamp Friday, where they surrender all of their fees, like all of their portion of a sale that occurs through Bandcamp. They give 100% of that money to the bands themselves. There's it's sort of a fee amnesty day that happens every couple of months. And I don't know if that is I don't know if that is going to be a permanent part of the platform or whatever, but that at a very minimum, that gives you an avenue where, every couple of months you can buy a handful of records and know that 100% of the money you're spending is going to the artists.
My final question for you is, how do we improve the audio quality of this podcast? Because it's really fucking bad and we all suck at it.
Well, for the moment, I'm talking through the little microphone in my laptop here, and I'm sure that can't be good. So what you could do is you could require your guests and your hosts to have, decent microphones at hand. Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely not going to happen. So sorry if you listen to the show. You'll continue.
Well, no, I'm the most maddening example because I actually have a decent microphone. I'm just terrible at using it the right way.
I know you stepped on it.
And you had a bad cable earlier, which has been rectified. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just stopped jiggling it because I have ADD.
You're so jiggly, man.
I mean,
can I just ask one quick question before we get out of here?
Go.
I'm super curious. Your Twitter now. You wrote for zines back in the day, and they were called in some circles mean zines. You feel like they were a precursor to sort of people dunking on each other on Twitter, except
yeah, absolutely,
a month and a half.
Hell yeah,
response.
That's what I felt.
Absolutely, there was the king of shade in that era was Gerard Cosloy, who had a fanzine called Conflict, where he would instigate beefs and maintain beefs for for issue after issue after issue, and he. Later on, he became a label executive. He ran Homestead Records and then Matador Records. He was one of the partners that started Matador Records. And he's like, for a while on the down low, he kept every few years, he would put out another issue of Conflict, and he would sort of try to, pump the bellows and try to re-inflame some of these beeves that he had. The plural of beef is beeve.
It's
right?
beeves, yeah.
Try to reinflate some of these or reignite some of these beeves over the years. His shade was absolutely fantastic. I wrote for a fanzine called Forced Exposure that had Byron Coley, who's one of the funniest and most insightful music writers of that generation, and Jimmy Johnson, both of whom not afraid to shit on people from a great height. I found that kind of thing exhilarating when the alternative to that was fanzines of a type like Maximum Rock and Roll, which was a sort of a hardcore punk fanzine that spent most of its energy boosting the scene and shining an affectionate light on things. And that sort of got wearying because every review was a good review. Every band was a significant and important band. Every perspective was a noble and heartfelt one. That the fatigue of that was relieved by reading a review where somebody was just unapologetically saying that this record was a piece of shit that shouldn't have been made and all copies should be burned, that sort of thing. I'm comfortable with both of those mindsets being part of the conversation. And the thing is that was all internecine. That was all within the music underground. That was none of it was ever trying to make a broader commentary on the rest of the world.
Do you ever tweet at Ministry?
Not that I'm aware.
Okay.
I should say, I've had a Twitter for a long time, but I kept it private for a very long time. Mm-hmm. I opened it up as a public thing for other people to see it. The occasion was this fall, my band was meant to go on tour, and it was a tour that had itself been postponed for a year for the pandemic. And we were canceling our tour, and I wanted to open my Twitter and explain to people who, rather than try to explain individually, I could just explain sort of generally why we were canceling the tour and what people should do with tickets, and that we were hoping to see them again in another year's time, and that we were trying to be responsible about it and not be a reason for people to congregate when it was clearly not safe for people to congregate, yada, yada. And I never expected or wanted the degree of engagement that I've gotten with the general public. I'm not comfortable talking about myself and my behavior unbidden, right? But what I did was I opened I knocked a door ajar, and once it was ajar, a bunch of people had shit they wanted to hang on me, and I felt like that was an opportunity to engage with them, as legitimately, as opposed to just blowing them off and going back underground. Yeah. And the problem that I have now, my intention was to keep the Twitter open and public for the duration, what would have been the duration of that tour, so that people could, I could interact with people who had tickets they wanted to reimburse, get refunded or whatever. At the end of that period, there were a large number of followers, because when your Twitter is public, you can't control who follows you except by individually blocking people.
Yeah.
Right. So for me to make my Twitter go private again, I would need to manage a sort of a subscription list of people and individually block thousands of people, which would make me feel like an asshole, for one, and also would be a lot of fucking work. So I kind of feel like just leaving it be now is probably the easiest solution, although it does put me in a position of getting, an extraordinary number of angry DMs from Joe Rogan fans, or, having my mentions blow up every time somebody wants to remind the world that I was in a band called Rape Man.
Well, what's worse, Joe Rogan fans now are Rites of Spring fans back in the day. Trash.
Rites of Spring fans, like they would, they'd get their feelings hurt and leave most of the time. Joe Rogan fans think that they are, they absolutely think that they are the smartest people in the room when they are demonstrably among the dumbest people in the room.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible spectacle. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but it sounds like you're in hell like the rest of us, and there's no leaving. So welcome to Twitter.
I can't blame anybody but me.
Yep. And none of us can ever leave. So let's, So I have a question. You're an experienced Twitter person, right? Unfortunately, yes.
I've had more than a few people ask me why I don't have a blue check on my name. And I'm curious, what does a blue check do? Why would I want one?
So
I genuinely don't understand what the concept of the blue check is.
It's really stupid. It's really just like a Black Mirror-y sort of Starbelly Sneetches thing. But like when Twitter started, there was this thing where like if you were a celebrity, they would need to verify that you were that celebrity, because people would make a bunch of accounts that were all like, hey, I'm Shaq and I'm tweeting as Shaq, and then Shaq's mad about that because he's like, I didn't fucking say that, So
right.
There was
that on a very small scale. There are a bunch of fake, or it used to be at least, I haven't checked in a while, but there used to be a bunch of fake Steve Albini accounts just because I didn't have a public profile.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's like an inevitability because people are just assholes when it comes to the internet, and so they'll, I can fucking fuck with people like this, right? But like that's how it started, I think, functionally. But then what happened is it's shifted over the years from a thing that like Twitter you just wake up one day if you were famous and there was a blue check on your name and you go, oh, they figured out I am who I am or whatever. Then there were periods where you could apply for one, and Twitter is home to certain types of people, and it's only a certain amount of time old, so the people that got in on the ground floor, the people that are like popular on it, are often popular for no reason other than that they were some dickhead living in New York, doing a writing quote unquote career or whatever, or blogging or whatever around the time that it sort of became a thing. So there's people that are like, they have absolutely no reason to have this like thing, but honestly, I applied for mine because I was still a young person who thought that there was a way to, climb the supposedly meritocratic system and career in comedy and writing. And so I thought, oh, you could apply. And I'd written an op-ed in the New York Times, and that's enough for them to give you one. And so, I got mine, and it's absurd because I'm just some guy, but now there are people who the verification process is just that. It's meaningless. I'm not a famous person, but I have one. But what it does is not only, I think, in the algorithm, but also just psychologically, it boosts your ability to be seen on Twitter because people will follow you back if you follow them and you have a blue check and stuff like that. People just
everything you're saying about it sounds like it's bad.
Yeah, it's a fucking torture device. And like I've known people who've like almost like a tattoo, like they had it removed, because it was like destroying their life or whatever. I still won't because it does get me stuff. For some reason, Katy Perry follows me on Twitter because she liked a thing I said once. It's insane. She only follows like 300 people, and she saw me making fun. I think it was making fun of Joe Rogan, and she just followed me. But like that stuff like that happens because the blue check mark then creates this like implication of being somehow of a certain quality, which is completely made up and bullshit. But I mean, it's like a fucking Shirley Jackson story or something. Like you just start to see all of the things that are happening within the people's minds projected onto the blue check mark. You could.
All right. Well, I'm just glad. I thought like if there was like. If they like sent you a windbreaker or
something. No, you shouldn't get one. Like it'll just make your life worse. And people already know who you are. I mean, if you're a young up and coming writer, I think there's maybe an argument for like, yeah, this might help you go from obscurity into this class of people that is a whole other fucking problem. But the only reason I would say maybe Steve Albini should get a blue check mark is to, like, if you're worried about the other imposter Steve Albinis, but it sounds like those people might actually take some of the heat off of you. And
I could care less. I mean, imagine a world so small that you think you could get some kind of cachet from dropping the name of a micro celebrity like me.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think I think you're doing it right. I think you should probably maintain a level of obscurity before Twitter comes for you like it comes for all of us. But what the fuck do I know? I don't know. I'm also someone no one knows. All right, well, yo, man, it was a fucking honor. Thanks for coming on our show.
Thanks for having me.
Big fan. And yeah, I'll probably put this out tomorrow and might hit you up for a retweet. But other than that, have a good one, man.
Do you have anything to plug?
I don't like plugging. I don't like promoting things. I think all advertising should be criminal. I don't like any kind of promotion of any kind.
Fair enough. No, that's awesome.
I was gonna plug Resonate, which is the indie streaming service we mentioned, but maybe we'll give them an anti-plug.
Well, I mean, like I said, I'm reluctant to throw my shoulder into anything like promoting anything just because, it's just as reasonable that whatever this one that you're promoting now is, like, they could be sold to somebody in a week and then behave completely differently,
True.
So I don't have a significant dog in the fight because my bands are so unpopular that the amount of money generated doesn't matter to me. So yeah, I just, like, on a visceral level, I dislike advertising and promotion. Like, when I see an ad on the television, I want to shut the television off. I think one of the nicest things about the internet is that there are these mechanisms that allow you to remove all the advertising. All the ad block functions are amazing. And if I could build one of those into my television, it would be great. But I have a whatever you call them, recorder that allows me to skip past the commercials when that's the second best thing.
Wait, so you're telling me that you're not here to unroll the new Steve Albini songs about fucking NFT, and it's a
new line of plugins, the Electrical Audio Signature series of plugins for studio and podcast recording.
Yeah.
No, I invented a plug blocker, like an ad blocker, but it's for podcasts. I would plug it, but if you're using it, you won't be able to hear the plug. So.
Damn, dude.
Be on the lookout for that.
You just blew my mind. All right, everyone. Let's get the fuck out of here.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Steve. Good to meet you.
All right. Well, let's do our plugs since we believe in plugs and get the fuck out of here. Anders, got anything?
At Anders Lee here on Twitter, public account. And do check out Resonate. They are. I suppose it's possible that they will sell out. I find it unlikely. So for now, you should check out Resonate and check out our Patreon, where we got some great series, which is the plural series. It's just series. We got another installment coming up of the Gladio series with the Corner Spatty folks. And also, we got a new one we just kicked off this week. It's series month, I guess. The old Smedley Butler, Smelly Butt Stuff, as we call him.
That's right.
We are doing a two-parter on that. We just released part 1 on the Patreon. Crazy, crazy life. If you don't know who he is, he was a Marine who did a bunch of dirty work for the United States and then went left wing in the 30s. So check that out on patreon.com/BoddamnAmerica.
Thank you for plugging our show. If you listen to our show, consider listening to more of our show.
Listen to more of it.
It's good.
It's better the more you do. It ramps up. It has momentum.
Yeah, it gives you, like, good brain damage to listen to nothing but our show. It's cool.
You know how having, like, 2 beers is whatever, but having, like, 8 beers is really fun? It's like that.
Yeah,
I once saw a t-shirt that said, "There is nothing more worthless in the universe than one beer." Yeah,
I agree with that.
Are you selling those
Yeah.
T-shirts? Are you plugging your T-shirt company?
I guess so. Damn.
We
I
have
just
new
fucking-
merch. It's that beer thing Anders saw.
Yeah, we're selling Spencer's gift shirts now that say 1 tequila, 2 tequila, 3 tequila floor and stuff like that.
If you can read this, the bitch fell off. Goddamn America.
You know what I'm also going to plug? Just to troll them, I'm going to plug Generation X, the entire generation.
There you go.
Oh, no.
They hate plugs.
Advertising of any kind. Just check them out.
Dude, we should start a magazine called Plug Busters. That's like we take down people that do plugs on the ends of podcasts. You know, from within inside the world of pluggers. I don't know.
Inside the world of pluggers.
Check it out.
Patak, you got anything?
Food co-ops everywhere. Plugbusters.
Aside from February, which is series month, I would plug my own Twitter at Patak Test Kitchen, your number one stop for exciting new flavors. Other than that, I also am not a sellout, and I don't really like plugs, so like I'm gonna no more plugs for me.
Damn.
I'm too busy keeping it real, unlike some other people on this podcast. Also, I was here the whole time.
Yeah.
So
That's how real you keep it. You didn't even talk on the podcast.
sometimes Steve Albini comes on, and it's time for my white ass to listen.
You just need... No, it contributed vibes.
Yeah. My camera was off, but I was nodding.
Just knowing Alex was there left a whole... Dude, it improved the quality of the show so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, I'm going to do plugs because I'm a fucking libtard cuck. Let's go Brandon or whatever.
Let's go, Brandon. I like to plug Brandon.
Yeah, I would. Let's plug Brandon. I have a live show here in Brooklyn that you can come to if you're a New York listener at The Gutter. It's happening on February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day. So if you got fucking dumped and you want to feel better, come over to The Gutter and listen to me do stand-up along with a bunch of my other friends. Alex, Patak will be on that show. My show is called MeatSpace. It's at The Gutter. It's February 15th. Doing another show on RushTix, an online comedy club, on February 24th. It's online comedy, so I'll use a green screen and I'll play the Di Serono on the Rocks commercial behind me, I promise. What else? Why You Mad's my other podcast at Feral Jokes on Twitter and every social media. I'm verified, unlike some people. And and I'm going on tour with the guy from Eve Six's band in April, and also We Are the Union, the ska band. I think that's it. I think that's plugs.
It's plugged.
It's plugged.
I hope you learned something today.